So good afternoon, everyone. We hope you enjoyed your lunch. Hope that you all were able to get something who wanted to get something. We're going to invite you, if you're done eating, to come into the chairs here, closer for the conversation. But you're certainly welcome to stay at your table. But if you are willing, it would be great for our speaker to have you join the community of chairs here in the front. And as you're coming, I'm going to remind us again that we're joined today by Pastor Mark Charles. If you were in worship, you'll know that he is the son of a Dutch mom and a Navajo dad. He offered us a very provocative sermon. Some of us may still be asking questions, but this is the place where you get to ask questions. Pastor Mark also has his books for sale and is going to lead us in what I imagine will be a continuing provocative conversation about radical inclusivity. So I'm just going to invite you to find your place. We're going to open with prayer, and then I'm going to hand it off. So there's plenty of seats in the front. There always are in church. Nobody wants to sit in the front. Here comes Charles King. Are you going to sit in the front? No, you're going to sit in the back. Okay. Reverend Charles. Reverend Charles King is going to model for us what it's like to come and sit on the front row. It's okay. This is the mourner's bench. There will not be fire and brimstone, though. You're safe in the front row. Look, Derek's sitting there, and Karen. Okay, so wherever you are, just inviting you to settle for a moment so that we can open with prayer. Okay, let's pray. God of grace and goodness, we give you thanks for our sibling, Mark Charles, and all that he has brought today to the Riverside Church. What he has brought that has stirred our hearts and our minds and made us hungry for what more there is to hear from you through him. And so as he prepares to come and continue to lead us in conversations about radical inclusivity, we pray to have open minds, open hearts, open hands for what our sibling will share. God, bless this time, bless the giving and the receiving and all that will come out of this conversation. It is our prayer in hope and in confidence in our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. So friends, I give you Pastor Mark Charles. Seats on the front row, if anyone would like to come. No takers? Carol?
Give me just a second. I'm sorry about this. I was talking in the back instead of setting up my computer like I would normally be doing. Can someone refresh me how much time we have? Are we talking like 75 minutes? Is that what we're doing? We have till 3. Oh, wow. Oh, wait, it's 1:30. Okay. I thought you meant 3 Pacific time. Sorry. Okay, I want to... My what? Oh, yeah, sure, just sit right there. If you know me, I have a podcast called My Second Cup of Coffee. So I'm still nursing my second cup right here. All right, let's see if this is working here. We got that there. Okay. Can everyone see that okay? Okay. So I'm so glad all of you came today to talk about this. There's some history that I want to discuss with you. And I want to just give you a little bit of an introduction here. I've already introduced myself. My mother is American of Dutch heritage. My father is Navajo. I grew up in a border town to the Navajo Nation. And I have been working for the past 20 years to understand the complexities of American history regarding race, culture, and faith. And today I want to give you a presentation on what's known as the Doctrine of Discovery. Now, I have to warn you that over the next 75 minutes, I will offend you. Just prepare yourself. I will offend you. It's not a matter of if, it's when. And usually it's going to be about 30 seconds after I offend the person sitting right next to you. So I make a very bipartisan critique, so no one's safe, the left or the right. That's the reason that my book that I co-authored, Unsettling Truths, is not a New York Times bestseller. To be a New York Times bestseller, you have to critique one side and get the applause of the other, and we critique both sides. So a response I get frequently from people who've read my book is they come up and they say, that was a great book. No, that wasn't a great book. That was a very hard book to read, but thank you for writing it. So just to warn you, I am going to talk about some things. Not only am I going to offend you, I'm going to shock you. And I'm going to talk about some things we don't know how to talk about as Americans. I'm going to talk about history that almost all of us, doesn't even matter the color of our skin, would prepare to have buried. And I'm going to challenge some deeply held beliefs that almost all of us have. I tell my audiences, it doesn't matter if your family came over on the Mayflower or if you jumped a fence last week, right? Almost everybody who came to this country, except for African people who were brought here, they were kidnapped, brought here, and enslaved, and Native peoples who are indigenous to these lands, everyone else immigrated here at some point in some hope of having some kind of a more prosperous life. And that's what makes this conversation so challenging, because I'm going to demonstrate to you, show to you why the United States of America is called the land of opportunity. And what's behind the scenes that makes this a place where people can come here and prosper. And it starts, let me see if I can take this microphone. I can. Hypothetically, I can. If I were stronger, I could have. There we go. So it starts with what we call the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery, it's a series of papal bulls, edicts of the Catholic Church. It says things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. This papal bull was written by Pope Nicholas V in 1452. So these papal bulls, they're essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman, and their lands are yours to take. So this is the doctrine that allowed European nations to go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They didn't see them as human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was literally lost at sea, land in what they called this new world and claim to have discovered it. The first sentence of the first chapter of Unsettling Truths says you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can conquer those lands, you can steal those lands, you can colonize those lands. You can't discover them unless something in your worldview informs you the people living there are not fully human. And if you don't believe me, right, just leave your car keys, your cell phones, your wallets out. Myself and a few dancers will come by. We'll be happy to discover these items for you. Right? Clearly, this is not discovery. This is colonizing. This is stealing. This is doing other illegal things, right? It's not discovery. And so this understanding that natives are not fully human is very foundational to this doctrine of discovery. Now, the challenge with this doctrine is it gets embedded into the foundations of our nation. And it literally, and in chapters 3 and 4 of our book, lay out, I don't have time to go into it today, but they lay out how the church got from the teachings of Jesus, right? The guy who said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. How'd they get from that teaching to a doctrine that said you can kill people who don't look like, worship like, act like, or eat like you do? And that journey is fascinating, how the church got there. And it got there by embracing empire. The thrust of that is the Doctrine of Discovery. It's a white male Christian supremacist doctrine that is the fruit of a church that has prostituted itself out to the empire. Now, in 1763, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains. And he says to the colonists that are here, the 13 colonies, that they no longer have the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset those colonists. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. And they went on to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason the Founding Fathers used the inclusive term all men is because their definition of who was human was incredibly narrow. So this makes the Declaration of Independence a systemically racist, sexist, they said men, not women, and white supremacist doctrine. A few years later, the founders wrote another document. This one they began with the words, "We the people of the United States." This, of course, is the preamble to the Constitution. But if you keep reading, just a few lines further, not even much further, just a few lines further, down to Article 1, Section 2. Article 1, Section 2 is the part of the Constitution that determines who is and who is not a part of this country, who is and who is not covered by this Constitution. If you read Article 1, Section 2, the first thing you will note is that it never mentions women. Now, this is important because if you read the entire Constitution, preamble all the way down to the 27th Amendment, you will find there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns. 51 he, him, and his. Who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by the document. There's not a single female pronoun in the entire Constitution. So we have to know Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women. Second, it specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who does this leave? Well, in 1787, that literally left white men. And technically, you had to be a white landowning male in order to vote. You see, we don't acknowledge this explicitly enough. The purpose of our Constitution, the reason the Constitution was written was to protect the interests of white landowning men. So we get upset, right, that in today's market, women earn 60 to 70 cents to the male dollar. This isn't surprising, right? The Constitution's working. We get upset that our prisons are filled with people of color. Well, this isn't surprising. The Constitution's working. People get upset that in 2010, the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United. They ruled that corporations now have the same right to political free speech as individuals. This ruling opened the door for super PACs. There are unlimited contributions to candidates. Again, this isn't surprising. Who runs the corporations? This is the Constitution protecting white landowning men. So we just have to acknowledge that this is where it's founded. And now maybe you're thinking, Mr. Charles, we've corrected that, right? Well, many people think that we did. They think we abolished slavery. They actually think what the Constitution says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. That's not what it says. We're going to talk about this a little bit later, but there's a clause in the amendment that says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist. The 13th Amendment doesn't abolish slavery. It redefines and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. So our Constitution is a blatantly racist, sexist, and white supremacist document. When I was running for the office of the presidency in 2020, I would say to my audiences when I spoke, I said, if you think the Constitution was written to protect everybody, get into a diverse group of people like this and read the document out loud. You will be appalled and embarrassed at how quickly our Constitution turned racist, sexist, divisive, and even white supremacist. Now, in 1823, we had a Supreme Court case, and this was Johnson versus McIntosh. It's two men of European descent, white men, that are litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe. The other one got the same land from the government, and they want to know who owned it. Who had the right to sell the land, the tribe or the government? The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. This is the John Marshall Court, considered one of the greatest jurists in Supreme Court history. And they had to determine the legal precedent for land titles. They ruled that it was discovery that gave title to the land. Now, because that might almost imply that native peoples might have some sovereignty over our lands, they had to clarify themselves. And so later they wrote in the same opinion, but the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages, whose occupation was war, whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. Essentially, they're saying, even though natives were here first, but because they're not human, they're merely occupants of the land, like a fish would occupy water, a bird would occupy air. And so they don't have the right of discovery to the land. That belongs to white people. So they actually are the ones who have the fee title to the land. So this case, along with a few others in 1820s to 1830s, create the legal precedent for land titles. That precedent and the Doctrine of Discovery are referenced by name by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. And I want to talk for a few moments about this 2005 case. I have a TEDx talk online. It's called We the People, the 3 most misunderstood words in U.S. history. It also goes through some of these same facts I'm going to lay out here. So in the 1700s, mid-1700s, the Oneida Indian Nation occupied about 6 million acres of land in central state New York. The Washington administration reduced that landholding to a few 100,000 acres through a treaty. And then they passed a bill saying only the federal government could purchase the lands from the tribe, and these lands were reserved expressly for the Oneida Indian Nation. The state of New York continued to illegally purchase these lands until all the lands were purchased and the Oneida were moved out. In the late 1900s, the Oneida Indian Nation came back and they purchased some of their traditional lands. They bought them on the open market, paid full price for them. And they wanted to reestablish their sovereignty over these lands. Now, the lands they bought were within the city limits of the city of Sherrill. And the city of Sherrill wanted the tax revenue from those lands, which the Oneida were not paying. So they sued them in federal district court. The court ruled in favor of the Oneida. So they appealed to the Federal Court of Appeals. The Federal Court of Appeals held up the original decision, so they joined with the county, and now they appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court heard the case, I think it was in 2004, and issued their opinion in 2005. Referenced by name the Doctrine of Discovery. They then go on to state that given the long-standing, distinctly non-Indian character of the area and its inhabitants, the regulatory authority constantly exercised by the New York State and its counties, and the United's long delay in seeking judicial relief, we hold the tribe cannot unilaterally revive its ancient sovereignty. They go on to state it is impossible to rescind the cession, this is from another case, and restore the Indians to their former rights because the lands have been open to settlement. Again, this was white settlement, and large portions of them are now in the possession of innumerable innocent purchasers. They go on to argue, and they say, moreover here, the properties have greatly increased in value since the United sold them 200 years ago. Notably, it was not until lately that the United sought to regain ancient sovereignty over lands converted from wilderness to become parts of city like Sherrill. Now, if that argument sounds familiar, it's because it's basically the same argument John Marshall made in 1823. We took your savage lands, we civilized them, and now you can't. We did what you couldn't do, and we can't give them back to you. Basically, it doesn't use the word savage in 2003, but in 2005, but it makes the exact same argument. So they conclude that we reject the unification theory of the United Indian Nation and the United States, again from the lower courts, and we hold that standards of federal Indian law, again footnote 1, Doctrine of Discovery, and federal equity practice preclude the tribe from rekindling embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. This is probably one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime, and it was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, this is shocking because the legacy of Justice Ginsburg is that she was a voice of dissent on an increasingly conservative Supreme Court fighting for the rights of the marginalized, which she was and which she did. However, because land titles are based on the legal understanding that natives are savages, this makes white supremacy a bipartisan value, which Justice Ginsburg demonstrated when she wrote this very white supremacist opinion. So the United States Supreme Court is a systemically racist, sexist, and white supremacist court that to this day has opinions based on the dehumanization of Native peoples. In 1630, I want to go back a few hundred years, there was a ship in what's now called the Boston Harbor. On board that ship was a Protestant minister. His name was John Winthrop. He was there with a group of people to plant the Boston colony, and he preached a sermon on board the ship called A Model of Christian Charity. In his sermon, he referred to the colonists that he was with as a city upon a hill. He's borrowing from the language of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, where he tells his disciples to be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining their good deeds into this dark world. He goes on to exhort them in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. They should rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. They should keep the unity of the Spirit within the bonds of peace. These are just your basic Protestant Sunday morning church exhortations. End of a sermon, he does what many pastors do when they want to exhort or compel their congregants to heed their exhortations, which is he quotes from the Bible, specifically the Old Testament of the Bible. And he quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now, Deuteronomy 30 is the passage of the Bible where the people of Israel are standing at the banks of the Jordan River, ready to cross over and take possession of their promised lands. And God is reiterating the threats and promises of the land covenant. If you obey me, I will bless you in these ways and do these things for you. If you disobey me, I will curse you in these ways and do these things to you. And in this passage it says, but if our hearts shall turn away so that we will not obey and we worship other gods, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river. But in his sermon, John Winthrop changes that word to vast sea. Now, why would he do that? Well, they didn't cross a river, right? They crossed an ocean. So what's he implying? Based on the exhortations of Jesus to be a city on a hill, based on the model of Old Testament Israel, they are standing on the shores of their promised lands, ready to go and take possession of them. Now, who here has read the books of Joshua and Deuteronomy? Right? God is very specific about how the people of Israel are to take possession of their promised lands. It says in Deuteronomy 20, however, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them as the Lord your God has commanded you. So promised lands for one people is literally God-ordained genocide for another. I call this sermon the birth of the myth of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism doesn't just say Americans are better at everything than everyone else is. It says we have a unique relationship with God than everybody else. So this is, right, 1630s. That idea percolates for about 100 years. Mid-1700s, we begin expanding westward. We establish a country. End of the 1700s, we have the Second Great Awakening. There's a growth in churches, a renewal within denominations. Now there's this religious fervor as we're going further and further west. Early 1800s, we coined the phrase manifest destiny. The belief that this white European Christian nation now has the God-given right to rule these lands from sea to shining sea. Now, we need to talk about this because we have a white supremacist, racist, and sexist Doctrine of Discovery, a white supremacist, racist, and sexist Declaration of Independence, a white supremacist, racist, and sexist Constitution, a white supremacist, racist, and sexist Supreme Court, and now we have God's permission to commit genocide. The two hardest chapters in the book, and I have some copies of this book for sale here if you'd like to buy one after the session. The two hardest chapters to read are chapters 9 and 10. 9 and 10 deals with the adage that says the victors write the history. Now, this isn't a difficult concept to understand. Most people agree with this. Yes, if you win a war, you get to write about the war. This is how history works. The victors write the history. So, I want you to imagine for a moment. Well, let's not go there quite yet. So I want to tell you about two men, Oscar Groening and Robert McNamara. Oscar Groening was a German. He was born in the early 1900s. He served in the Nazi army during World War II. He was an accountant. He was actually serving at Auschwitz. He wasn't guarding people. He wasn't gassing people. He wasn't shooting people. He was an accountant. He worked in a little office or room when they brought the Jewish people into the camp. They took all their possessions. They set them in front of Oscar. He assessed their value, made a report, and passed it up the chain of command. Now, he knew what was going on in the camp. He saw what was happening, and he was appalled by it. He actually asked for a transfer numerous times, but he was denied every time. Finally, towards the end of the war, he got his transfer. He was transferred to the front lines. He was captured, and he was sitting in a prison camp when the war ended. After the war was over, he went quietly back to Germany, and he lived his life. In the late 1900s, the Holocaust denier movement began to get some traction. And he was appalled at the things his countrymen were denying they had done. And because he served at Auschwitz, he gave an account of what he saw when he was there, what his nation did. After one interview he gave on the BBC, which was fairly public, he was arrested. And he was charged with complicity to 300,000 murders. He went before the judge, and he said, I have no doubt that I'm complicit. I was a part of this machine that did horrific things, and I absolutely was a part of that machine. Now, if I'm legally guilty of murder, he said, that's what you need to decide. He was tried, and he was found guilty. He was actually in the appeals process in the early 2000s when he died. And he died a condemned war criminal. Now, about the same time, there was another man who was born. His name was Robert McNamara. He was born just 5 years apart from Oscar Groening, and he was in the US. I think he was born in California. And he was also in the military. He served in the Pacific Theater of the US Air Force. And he was also a data guy. He was an analyst. And so he was analyzing the bombing raids that we were doing over Japan and other countries in the Pacific. And one of his jobs was to analyze the effectiveness of their bombs, and he reported back through his research that we were not very precise with our bombings. Because in our efforts to avoid anti-aircraft guns, we were flying our bombers really high, and we didn't really understand the jet stream really well back then, and so they were getting blown off course. We were missing our targets. And so he suggested to General LeMay, who was in charge of the Pacific Theater, that we fly the bombers lower. Now, LeMay was actually planning a bombing raid. It was called Operation Meeting House. It was the deadliest bombing raid in the history of the world. We burned to death 100,000 Japanese civilians in the city of Tokyo when we bombed Tokyo. We chose Tokyo because we knew it was made of wood and it would burn hotter. And Robert McNamara's strategy worked. Our bombers were very precise, they hit their targets, and we destroyed much of the city. It was so effective, LeMay used the strategy throughout the rest of the war in his bombing raids across Japan and other nations. And he used it in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. All told, we killed about 300,000 civilians in Japan as we closed out World War II. After the war was over, Robert McNamara was given the Legion of Merit, which is a very distinguished military award. Then he was discharged, and he was tapped by President Kennedy to serve in as the Secretary of Defense. He was one of the architects of the Vietnam War, including our use of Agent Orange there. After he was done serving as Secretary of Defense, he was given the Medal of Freedom, which is the highest military honor you can get in our country as a civilian. And at the end of his life, he was wrestling with what he was complicit in. And he was a part of a documentary called The Fog of War. And he was interviewed in this documentary, and he was reflecting on what he had been involved in, and he said the human race prior to that time and today has not really grappled with the rules of war. Was there a rule that said you shouldn't burn to death 100,000 civilians in a single night? Pause. LeMay said, their general said, if we lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. And I think he's right. He, and I'd say I, were behaving as war criminals. Now, he didn't die a condemned war criminal. He actually died with honor. He died and was buried with honors. So what's the difference between Robert McNamara and Oscar Groening? Is one good, one bad? One right, one wrong? One righteous, one unrighteous? Or did one side win and the other side lose? Right, they were both complicit in 300,000 civilian deaths. Oscar Groening was found and died a condemned war criminal. Robert McNamara acknowledged he was a war criminal, but he was buried with honors. The only difference is whose side won and whose side. That's the only difference. Okay? Now, that's not what's going to make chapters 9 and 10 so hard. What makes chapters 9 and 10 so hard is we point out the fact that the United States of America has never lost a war that matters. We've never given up large tracts of land. We've never been invaded. We've never had a regime change. We've never been disarmed. We've never borne the scorn of the global community. We've never lost a war that matters. Technically, the Korean War is still going on. We pulled out of Vietnam. We pulled out of Afghanistan, but we didn't lose any land there. We've never lost a war, and as a result, our nation, I'm going to be specific, white men, have written their own history for 250 years. What makes chapters 9 and 10 so challenging to read is we take the adage, the victors write the history, and we apply it to this man. When the victors write the history, the victors often create mythology. And because we've never lost a war that matters, we actually don't know much about Abraham Lincoln. We know almost next to nothing about this man. So I'd like to introduce you to him. The same way he introduced himself to the nation when he ran for Senate in 1858. It was already known he was against chattel slavery, but that wasn't the question of the day. The question of the day was, where do you stand on the civil rights of people of color? And so in the early debates, he had to establish himself. Now, those debates are radically different than the debates we have today. Today, our debates are all about sound bites, right? Just 30 seconds here, 25 seconds there, 10 seconds here. Back in the day, the first candidate would speak for about 20 minutes. The second candidate would respond for about 30 to 40 minutes, and the first candidate would come back and have another 10 to 15-minute response. It was a set of 3 speeches. So in his speech, Abraham Lincoln said this: "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And insomuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." Abraham Lincoln was a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist. Now, why would he introduce himself in the debates this way? Well, in the 2022 midterm elections, just prior to the elections, we had a pretty big disruption with our Supreme Court, right? Where they overturned Roe versus Wade. And so everyone who ran for office in 2022 had to take a position on a woman's right to choose, the right of the child, and about Roe versus Wade. Everyone, no one was accepted from that. You had to take a position of where you stood on this issue, and those who were emboldened about it made their positions very, very strong. So prior to the 1858 midterm elections, there was another Supreme Court case in 1857 about Dred Scott. And this case concluded that formerly enslaved peoples did not get protection from our Constitution or our Declaration of Independence. And so the discussion around the 1858 midterm elections was, where do you stand on the civil rights of people of color? And Abraham Lincoln was making it absolutely clear he 100% supported the Dred Scott decision. He was a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist. Until the day he died. Now, we need to discuss his legacy, right? So the legacy of Abraham Lincoln is the 13th Amendment, which again, most people thinks it abolishes slavery. It doesn't, but that's what they think it does. To understand the 13th Amendment, you have to understand the Lincoln-Douglas debates. But we don't read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right? Because we know it says things we don't want to know. It tells us things we don't want to hear. And so to understand the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the 13th Amendment, we have to understand these debates. So Abraham Lincoln went on to he lost the Senate race, and he went on to run for president in 1860, and he won that election. Now, on the morning of his election, Congress was having fits, because several states were threatening to secede from the Union, because of the election of Abraham Lincoln. Remember, he was against chattel slavery. And so that morning of his inauguration, they actually passed an amendment in the Senate called the Corwin Amendment. The Corwin Amendment stated that no amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to service. The Corwin Amendment essentially constitutionally protected enslavement in states where it already existed. And it was passed that morning of his inauguration. In his inauguration, Abraham Lincoln, of course, had to address race. And he said, apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the ascension of a Republican administration, their prosperity and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all of the published speeches of him who now addresses you. I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare that, and he literally begins quoting himself from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He goes on in his address to say, I understand a proposed amendment to the Constitution to the effect that the federal government shall never interfere with the domestic institutions of the states, including that of persons held to service, to avoid misconstruction of what I have said, holding such a provision as to now by implied constitutional law, I have no objection to its being made express and irrevocable. So he's saying I have no problem constitutionally protecting enslavement in states where it already exists. Now, even though the president has no role in amending the Constitution, Abraham Lincoln took it upon himself to mail the amendment out to all of the governors, asking them to ratify it. It never got ratified. Otherwise, this would have been our 13th Amendment. Now, in the fall of 1862, there was an op-ed written in the New York Tribune. It was written by Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the Tribune. And in his op-ed, he demanded that Abraham Lincoln keep his campaign promise and emancipate enslaved peoples. Now, Abraham Lincoln already had the Emancipation Proclamation written. It was in his desk. But there were four northern states, the states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, that had not left the Union, but they allowed enslavement. And Abraham Lincoln was afraid about losing the support of the white slave owners in those states if he released the Emancipation Proclamation. So instead of releasing the proclamation, he wrote a letter that he responded. And in his letter, he said, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. So his response was to tell the slave owners, I'm not doing this because I care about black people. Black lives don't matter to me, he said. I'm doing this to save the Union. Now, early 1863, Abraham Lincoln did release the Emancipation Proclamation. And if you read the proclamation, it's actually pretty clear about where enslaved peoples are freed. They're freed in Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. Missing from that list are Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And the enslaved peoples in those states didn't get their freedom until sometime after Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. And just so you know, he didn't forget about them. It actually says in the Emancipation Proclamation that accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. So again, this brings us to the 13th Amendment, which we have to view through the lens of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. We like to imagine the 13th Amendment actually abolished slavery. But that's not what it does. And so President Lincoln had a dilemma in 1862 and 1863, which is he was against chattel slavery. He didn't like that institution of buying and selling people. But he by no means thought black people were equal. He saw them as inferior and white people as superior. And so now he had to come up with a solution of what am I going to do with the people who are now enslaved once they get their freedom. And all things were on the table, right? Do we send them back to Africa? What do we do? He was asked in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, does he think the Declaration of Independence applies to black people? He said, well, I think the authors of that noble instrument intended to include all men, but they did not mean to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say all men are equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity. He's not saying some men are taller and some men read more. He's saying one group of men are superior and the other group of men are inferior. And he's made it very clear which one he believes belongs to which group. He was also asked about making citizens of black people. And he said, well, Judge Douglas hasn't asked me this before, but he won't have to ask it again. I tell him very frankly, I am not in favor of Negro citizenship. It's my opinion that the different states have the power to make a Negro citizen under the Constitution, if they chose, but if the state of Illinois had that power, I should be opposed to the exercise of it. Cries of good, good, and applause from the North responded to him. You see, Judge Douglas and Abraham Lincoln disagreed on chattel slavery. They did not disagree on white supremacy. Judge Douglas thought we needed white supremacy or needed enslavement to keep white supremacy in place. Abraham Lincoln was quite confident we could keep white supremacy in place without the institution of chattel slavery. That was their debate. So his solution was to put a clause in the 13th Amendment. He didn't want our foundations to apply to black people. He didn't want them to become citizens. And so his solution was to put a clause keeping enslavement legal within our prison system in our Constitution. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime whereof the party has been duly convicted shall exist. This amendment does not abolish slavery, it redefines and codifies it. This is why we have the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world. This is comparing us to NATO nations. When we break it out by people of color, it's even worse. We incarcerate Latinx and Hispanic at a rate of 831 per 100,000, American Indians at a rate of 895 per 100,000, and black Americans at a rate of 2,306. White people are much more palatable numbers at 450 per 100,000. So we just have to be clear, right? Abraham Lincoln gave us the tool that we are using today to remove the civil rights of people of color. He kept slavery legal. It's codified constitutionally within our criminal justice system. And we're using that extensively to this day to remove the rights of people of color. He was a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist until the day he died. But we knew that, right? We knew that. We all know enough about Lincoln to know we shouldn't read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right? We're aware of that. We know there's things in there we don't want to know about him. Who's been to the Lincoln Memorial? Keep your hand up. Who's been to the museum at the base of the memorial? At the museum, at the base of the memorial, there's a museum about half the size of this room. On every wall, there are plaques, a little bit smaller than the doors. They're about 4 feet tall, 2.5 feet wide. They're marble plaques with quotes by Lincoln etched in them. On one wall is Abraham Lincoln's thoughts about the Union, and in the middle of that wall it says, "I will save the Union. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." There is a plaque hanging at the Lincoln Memorial that literally states, according to Abraham Lincoln, black lives don't matter. It's not hanging there in lament. It's not hanging there in mourning. It's not hanging there to call him out. It's hanging there to celebrate it. Look at how much this man loved our Union. So much he didn't give a damn about black people. But that's not the end of the story. That's only half the story. We have to talk about Abraham Lincoln's relationship with Native peoples. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed two bills. He signed the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. The Homestead Act allocated 160 acres to anyone willing to go west and homestead for 5 years. The Pacific Railway Act allocated the land and the resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway. Okay, those were signed the spring and summer of 1862. In the fall of 1862, the Dakota Nation, they had signed a treaty with the U.S. government prior that said if they gave up certain lands, they would get the resources necessary to get through the harsh winters in Minnesota. And so the last winter had been really cold, and they did not get the treaty obligations from the U.S. government. And it nearly killed them. And they were concerned they weren't going to make it through another winter. So in the fall, a group of their warriors were out, maybe coming back from a hunting party, and they came back and they came across a white settlement, and they went inside the settlement to steal some eggs. They were confronted, and a fight broke out, and they killed several of the settlers. After that, they went back to their people. They told them what they had done. The people debated back and forth, what are we supposed to do? Do we turn our warriors in? Do we go to war? They weren't sure what to do. They were not convinced they were going to get their treaty obligations and that they would not make it through another winter. So they reluctantly decided to go to war against the U.S. government. The war lasted a little over a month. It was very bloody, a lot of violence and death on both sides. End of the war, half of the Dakota warriors fled north into Canada and the other half surrendered. Those who surrendered were immediately put into military tribunals. They were now being judged by the very people they were just fighting. The trials lasted just a few minutes. They were in a language that Dakota didn't understand. They shared witnesses. By all assessments, these were legal shams. They weren't real trials. End of the trial, several hundred of the Dakota were found guilty, and they were condemned to death. The order went all the way up to Abraham Lincoln. No one could bring themselves to sign the order to hang over 400 Dakota people. So it got to Lincoln, and he couldn't bring himself to do it, so he decided to, rather than order retrials, he would just change the criteria what warranted a death sentence. Under his new criteria, only 2 of the warriors were going to die. And now he was afraid of what was already happening, which was that his settlers in Minnesota were going to start rebelling and take things into their own hands, which they were doing. And so for a second time, instead of ordering retrials, he changed the criteria again and landed on the magic number of 38. So the day after Christmas, 1862, by order of Abraham Lincoln, the largest mass execution in the history of our country took place with the hanging of the Dakota 38. In January 29 of 1863, I just want to read this for you. This is from the Smithsonian Magazine. It says, in the frigid dawn of January 29, 1863, Sagwitch, a leader among the Shoshone of Beaogi, our big river in what is now Idaho, stepped outside his lodge and saw a curious band of fog moving down the bluff towards him across the half-frozen river. The mist was no fog, though. It was steam rising in the sub-zero air from hundreds of U.S. Army foot soldiers, cavalry, and their horses. The Army was coming for his people. Over the next 4 hours, the U.S. soldiers, 200 U.S. soldiers under Colonel Patrick Connor's command, killed 250 or more Shoshone people, including at least 90 women and children and infants. The Shoshone were shot, stabbed, and battered to death. Some were driven into the icy river to drown or to freeze. This is actually one of the bloodiest massacres in the history of our nation, and no one knows anything about it. It was worse than Wounded Knee. It was worse than Sand Creek. And almost no one knows anything about it. In February of 1863, in response to the Dakota War of 1862, Abraham Lincoln nullified all of the treaties with the Native nations in Minnesota. In March, with no treaties and no new negotiations, he now ordered the removal of all the Native nations from Minnesota. They were put on wagons, put on barges. They were marched out of the state into the Dakota territories. They were put on land that wasn't sustainable for them. It was a very oppressive and even violent removal. In the fall of 1863, one of Abraham Lincoln's generals, General Carleton, gave this order about my people in the Southwest. He said, "Henceforth, every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner on sight. Say to them, go to the Bosque Redondo, or we will pursue you and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or move. There can be no other talk on this subject." Army captains like Kit Carson went through my people's land. They burned our homes, they destroyed our crops, they butchered our livestock, and they hunted our people around our traditional lands. In his book of the Navajo by Raymond Friday Locke, he records, by the middle of December, most of the weak and aged had died. There is hardly a Navajo family that cannot remember tales of an aged grandfather, a pregnant mother, or a lame child that had to be left behind when the camp had to be quickly deserted. The patrols were not interested in taking captives. It was too much trouble to transport them back to the forts. Any Navajo they saw was shot on sight. Mothers were sometimes forced to suffocate their hungry, crying babies to keep their families from being discovered and butchered by an army patrol. They went through our lands. They rounded our people up, nearly 10,000 of my people, and marched us down to Bosque Redondo. Hundreds of my people died of starvation and exposure along the route. At Bosque Redondo, D. Brown, in the book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, records, it was a wretched land. The soldiers prodded them with bayonets. To shelter themselves, they had to dig holes in the sandy ground. They lived like prairie dogs in burrows. It was a bad place. Escape was difficult, and many were risking their lives just to get away. 10,000 people were brought to and imprisoned on this reservation. They called it a reservation. Nearly a quarter of my people died in what wasn't a reservation. It was actually a death camp. A death camp that was approved by Abraham Lincoln on January 15 of 1864. In the spring of 1864, Abraham Lincoln signed the second half of the Pacific Railway Act. This allocated more land and resources to complete the railway. It also gave the mineral rights to the rail companies so they could be financially incentivized to work faster. In the fall of 1864, the US Army, a Union Army, was coming over a hill in eastern Colorado. He came across the Cheyenne and Arapaho reservation. The Cheyenne and Arapaho were on their treaty grounds. They were waving a white flag of surrender and an American flag to show they were there peacefully. It was early in the morning. The warriors were out hunting. It was mostly elders and women and children in the camp. And this Union Army, led by a Methodist pastor, ordered all of them slaughtered. Later that night, it was reported that the Union soldiers paraded the genitalia of the Cheyenne Arapaho down the streets of Denver in celebration of this massacre. A week later, in his annual address, Abraham Lincoln reported that 1.5 million acres were entered under the Homestead Law, and that the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific states by railway and telegraph lines has been entered upon with a vigor that gives assurance of success. What made him so confident? Why was he so confident they would complete Manifest Destiny now? After the hanging of the Dakota 38 and the Bear River Massacre and the Navajo Long Walk and the Sand Creek Massacre, why was he so confident? Well, here's a map of our country with the early routes of the railway on it. The northern route went from Duluth, Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and came out near Seattle, Washington. The primary and central route had made it to Omaha, Nebraska. It had to go through Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and come out near San Francisco. And there was a northern route that went through northern New Mexico, northern Arizona, and came out near Los Angeles. After the removal of the Winnebago and Dakota from Minnesota, after the Bear River Massacre in northern Utah and southern Idaho, after the long walk of the Navajo and the Mescalero Apache in the southwest, and after the Sand Creek Massacre in eastern Colorado, you can see Abraham Lincoln had essentially ethnically cleansed the three primary routes of the railway. Not only was Abraham Lincoln one of the most not only was Abraham Lincoln a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist, but he was actually one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history. It's no wonder that his memorial in the mall is based after a Greek temple. If we make heroes out of common, everyday war criminals, we make gods out of genocidal presidents. Now, just so you don't think he was an aberration, right? He was just a unique one in our nation's history. Just briefly, let's talk about the 19th century, okay? This is the century your history books taught you was the century of expansion. This is the century we added 30 new states to the Union. I made this chart of our nation from 1775 to 2016. Every year in blue is a year our nation was in a declared state of war or armed military conflict against another nation or entity. Every year in red is every year I found we were fighting against native nations. You can see from 1811 to 1886, we had almost 75 straight years of warfare against native nations. This is the wars I found we fought primarily during the 19th century. So clearly this was not a century of expansion, right? This was a century of ethnic cleansing and genocide. This is a map of our country. And by 1840, we had reached, you can see the dark lands to the east. This is where we had reached. The empty lands to the south are uncharted lands, or whatever they're called. The name slipped my mind right now. Territories. If you look up Medals of Honor, you can find Medals of Honor awarded by war and by conflict. If you look up Medals of Honor awarded by our Congress for the Indian War campaigns, you will find that between 1839 and 1898, the US Congress awards 425 Medals of Honor to US soldiers who fought in the Indian War campaigns. End of that century, this is what our nation looked like. You can see we've completed our manifest destiny, made it all the way from the east to the west coast. During that century, the majority population ballooned from 5.3 million to 76.2 million, and the American Indian population collapsed from 600,000 to 237,000. If you're doing your math, that's a 61.47% rate of genocide. If you're comparing your math, that's almost twice the rate of genocide the Nazis had over Jews in World War II. So just to be clear, between 1839 and 1898, the United States Congress awards 425 Medals of Honor for the ethnic cleansing of American Indians and the genocide of Native peoples. In the 1500s, the world population was 480 million. In 1900, it was 1.6 billion. That's a 3.39% rate of growth. Europe went from 82 million to 300 million for a 3.65 rate of growth. Africa went from 63 million to 123 million. Even with the horrors of the slave trade, it still grew by a rate of 1.782%. North America went from 0 people, right, if we were all savages, to 76.2 million. Turtle Island, and a conservative estimate of Native peoples living in continental United States in the 1500s was 6 million people, to a low in the 1900s of 237,000. That's a 0.0395% rate of growth, or a genocide rate of 96.05%. And we knew what we were doing. Peter Burnett, who was the first governor of California, in his State of the State address in 1851, wrote that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. It must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying disease has broken out and we can't stop it, and he's not saying famine has struck and we can't feed them. He's literally saying we can't stop killing them until they're gone. And this, of course, is in perfect alignment with Promised Land theology. In Joshua 10, it says, "So Joshua subdued the whole region, including the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes, together with all their kings. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded." Now again, you're thinking, Mr. Charles, we don't think this way anymore. I want to remind you, back in 2015, the Obama administration was trying to negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran. And the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, came to the U.S. to lobby, to protest that agreement. He was invited against protocol to speak to a joint session of Congress. And in his remarks, he had to find a way to get both sides of Congress behind him. Now, that Congress, just like today, was completely divided, weren't even talking to each other. And so early in his speech, he hit on one of the most unifying themes in American politics, which is the theme of American exceptionalism. And he said to our Congress, because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. To bipartisan applause. If you're wondering why the United States Congress has almost unanimous support, bipartisan support for Israel, it's because we have a very codependent, dysfunctional relationship with the modern nation-state of Israel. We need their legacy of promised lands to justify what we did to Native Americans and African Americans. And the modern nation-state of Israel needs our flourishing as a nation with a manifest destiny to justify what they're doing to Bedouins and Palestinians. We have a very dysfunctional, codependent relationship with the modern nation-state of Israel. It has almost nothing to do with human rights or freedom. It's about justifying violence, and in our case, even genocide. Now I want to talk to you a little more closer to home. I know we're in the Northeast. I know the Northeast leans very liberal and likes to fancy itself very progressive in regards to issues on race. But I also know you're Americans. And even justices like Ruth Bader Ginsburg write white supremacist opinions. So I need to challenge you. And I want to do it on this conversation we're trying to have right now today on white Christian nationalism. See, the challenge is we don't have the tools to have a conversation about white Christian nationalism. We don't have the tools. First of all, we have an incredibly simplistic, almost childish political system. It's a binary two-party system. This makes every dialogue binary. Doesn't encourage compromise. It encourages just stick it to them when you're in power and do something else when you're out of power. Second, we all live in news bubbles, right? You're very aware of the Fox news bubble. But there's also a CNN, MSNBC news bubble, just as toxic. And both these bubbles exist for two reasons: to keep a political party in power and to make people angry and afraid. And we all live in those things. Plus, we've never lost a war that matters. So most of the history we thought we knew is actually mythology. And so we are some of the most ill-equipped people in the world to have a conversation about white Christian nationalism. Let me demonstrate this to you, right? Okay, so in 2015, or 2020, sorry, we all saw a very public lynching of George Floyd. It was horrific. And it caused a huge outcry in our nation and in cities around our nation. There were protests about police violence, about systemic racism, all these things just bubbling up everywhere. Now, on June 1st of 2020, there was protests going on in D.C. in Lafayette Park, right in front of the White House. And there had been protests there ever since the killing of George Floyd. And on the morning of June 1st, law enforcement went out and aggressively cleared the park. After it was empty a few hours later, President Trump walked through the park, across the street, and stood in front of St. John's Church. He held up his Bible upside down at first, then he turned it around, and he took this picture. Right now, this is seared in all of our brains. We've seen this picture over and over and over again. And he was called out immediately for what he was doing, which was he was giving a dog whistle to white Christian nationalists. That's what he was doing. We knew he was doing it. He knew he was doing it. Everyone knew he was doing it. The media knew he was doing it. He was called out immediately for doing what he was doing. Now, in 2020, there was a race going on. I was in the race. There were two other candidates in the race. You might have heard about them. They were both white landowning men from the 1%. And, right, even in regards to George Floyd, Trump's solution to George Floyd was maybe, perhaps, we might just want to think maybe about banning one or two types of chokeholds. Do you know what Joe Biden's solution was? He suggested we train our officers to shoot people in the kneecaps instead of in the chest. Both of these are idiotic ideas, right? Neither one of them helped Jacob Blake, who was shot in the back multiple times, wasn't choked and wasn't killed, but absolutely endured systemic racism. So Joe Biden was running for president, and he was promising to bring statesmanship back into the White House. He promised that he would speak in more complete sentences. He promised he would not do his foreign policy over Twitter, right? He promised he would act like a statesman. He was tested. He won the election, and he was tested in early 2021 because there was a terrorist attack in Afghanistan on U.S. soldiers. It was a bloody attack, took us by surprise, and several soldiers lost their lives. President Biden had to make a remark after it had happened. In his remarks, this is what he said. He said, "To those who carried out this attack, as well as anyone who wishes America harm, know this. We will not forgive, we will not forget, we will hunt you down and make you pay. I will defend our interests and our people with every measure at my command." Now, about a year ago, people got all up in arms when Putin spoke the exact same way. Right? He said, if any of this war spills onto Russian soil, I will defend my country with every measure at my command, and especially Americans, especially the Democratic Party, was outraged. How dare you talk that way? You are a nuclear power. You are threatening nuclear warfare. How irresponsible. When our own president spoke this way just about a year earlier. President Biden goes on in his remarks. He says, I want to thank the Secretary of Defense, military leadership. There's been unanimous help from every commander in the objectives of the mission. Then he goes on and he says, those who have served through the ages have drawn inspiration from the book of Isaiah, when the Lord says, whom shall I send and who shall go for me? And the American military has been answering for a long time, here am I, Lord, send me. Here I am, send me. In his first State of the Union, Joe Biden used the word sacred twice. He used it once in reference to the Capitol. This was a sacred space to give his speech. He used it again in reference to our sacred obligation to take better care of our veterans. Now, I do not disagree. We have an absolute moral obligation to take better care of people who fight wars for us. But he used the word sacred. Why did he bring the aspect of the divine into that statement? Because Joe Biden believes the U.S. military is the army of the Lord, responding to a prophetic call on par with that of Isaiah the prophet. If you think white Christian nationalism is merely a right-leaning Republican Party, I beg of you, turn off CNN and MSNBC. Get out of your news bubble. They're never going to tell you this. It would destroy their advertising revenue. Don't watch Fox News. They don't have the theological acumen to understand what's going on. But we are some of the most ill-equipped people in the history of the world to have a conversation about white Christian nationalism. It is a bipartisan value. Our nation was built on it. And we have to learn how to talk about it. One of the things that I am trying to do, I absolutely believe with every fiber of my being that the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation I would put on par with the Truth and the Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. But I would never call ours truth and reconciliation. Because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony, which is not accurate. Racial reconciliation is a misnomer. Race is not defined genetically. It's a human construct. And we constructed it to oppress and divide. We don't need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We have to mediate this dispute for the very first time. We need a Truth and Conciliation Commission. And I think we need it sooner rather than later. There's a quote by George Erasmus. He's a Dene leader from what's called Canada. And when he was writing about the TRC in Canada, he used this quote. He said, "Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community," he said, "you have to start where communities to be formed, common memory must be created." I love this quote because I think it gets to the heart of our nation's problem, especially about race, which is we don't have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers the mythological legacy of discovery, expansion, opportunity, and exceptionalism. And we have communities of color that have the lived experience of stolen lands and broken treaties, of enslavement and Jim Crow laws, of Indian massacres and boarding schools, of segregation, mass incarceration, Jim Crow laws, internment camps, families being ripped apart at our borders. We have no common memory, and there's no point in U.S. history where we had healthy relationship across racial lines. Has never existed in the history of our country. I'm teaching this history not to cancel people, not to shame people. I'm teaching this history because I want to create this common memory, because I want to have healthy community on these lands. That's my vision. That's my goal. That's what I'm working towards. Thank you. And I want to invite you to join me in learning this history, of teaching this common memory, and of learning how to have these conversations we are so afraid of having. I appreciate you coming out this afternoon. It's been an honor to be with you. Thank you all very, very much. Let me say one more thing. Okay. We're going to do a few minutes of Q&A. I want you to let you know I have about 40 books in the back, which you can buy a signed copy of my book, Unsettling Truths, which has a lot of the same history, laid out a bit differently. But I also have what's called my book study special, where if you buy 10 copies of my book, either from me today or on my website online, I will sell you those books for full price, $200, but I will give your study a virtual 45-minute Q&A for free at some point whenever you want to schedule over the next year. So it's a great way to kind of have dialogue with me after you've gone through the book. But now I think we want to take a few minutes to do some Q&A. We have a few minutes for Q&A.
And I also want to say to those who are joining us online, if you drop your questions in the chat, we will share those also with Pastor Mark. Anyone have a question? Please come to the microphone.
Thank you for being here. You mentioned that there was, at least I thought I heard you say there is a Native American Bible?
Yes,
Bookstore?
a good friend of mine, Terry Wildman, has been working with a group of Native peoples, and they've created a translation of the Bible. It's in English, but it uses the Native worldview. It's not a scholarly Bible, so it's not like been academically tested, but they have put a lot of work into it, and it allows you to read the scriptures from a different worldview. I highly recommend it. I know they sell it online. InterVarsity Press published it. I think they said they have some copies here as well.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask, I always thought that Andrew Jackson was worse. So I'm wondering, than Lincoln, I'm wondering what you think about those two presidents.
Two peas in a pod.
Okay.
Yeah. The primary difference is Andrew Jackson's from the South, and so it's easier to dislike him. Whereas the mythology of Lincoln is he won his wars. And so we create a mythology around him. But that was a good question. Any other questions?
I totally agree with you about our political system, its binary nature. I guess I'm wondering, given the realities that we're stuck in this, where do we go with the kinds of issues that you have raised? How do we, is there any hope of working within the political system as it exists now?
That's a great question. The question is, where do we go? How do we deal with this politically? And I ran for president in 2020 because I do believe we have some methods that we can use to work this out. However, I ran as an independent. As I demonstrated here and even more clear in my book, the two parties, the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is not one's racist and the other's anti-racist. It's one is explicitly racist and the other is implicitly racist. That's the difference between the two. And so what we need to do is we need to find a way to basically be honest about both sides. So when I give my lectures, some of the most enthusiastic crowds I speak to are right-leaning conservatives. People who would never self-select to come to hear me speak, but they get stuck in a room and they don't know who I am and then they don't know what I'm going to talk about until it's too late to leave politely, and so they have to stay and listen. And those are the people who are the most enthusiastic about my presentations because I'm giving them something they would never self-select, but they acknowledge, wow, this is really compelling stuff. I critique both sides, and I have to prep both sides. Critiquing the right is like critiquing a 5-year-old, right? They're kind of proud of what they've done, and they don't want to hide it. Critiquing the left is like critiquing a teenager, right? They know a little more that what they want isn't necessarily great. They're a bit better about hiding it, and they even think they can convince you that it's a good thing. I have to prep more to critique the left than I do have to critique the right. That's one of the challenges I face. And so the presentation about Biden, I have a whole thing about the 2016 election in my book where I talk about that. I try to lay these out because I want people to understand it's not that one's for and one's against. They both have these foundations. These are bipartisan values written into our foundations, and we have to address them there. Now, I ran as an independent, and I truly think if we're ever going to get change, it's going to have to come from an independent party. But the hardest group of people to convince, to not to get to agree with you, but to vote for you, are Democrats. Many Democrats like my message. Many Democrats like the things I'm talking about. They will self-select to come and hear me speak, and they will applaud and cheer when I'm giving these points. When I ran in 2020, what surprised me was how many of my left-leaning friends came to me during the campaign and said, "Mark, I can't vote for you." I was finally giving them a way to concretely act on change, and they said, "I can't vote for you. It's way too dangerous. Voting for you is like voting for Trump." Now, the Libertarian Party, which takes voters from the right, is actually bigger and better organized than the Green Party, and actually gets more votes than the Green Party does. The Democrats aren't concerned, or the Republicans aren't concerned about them. Why? Because they're both fighting different battles. The Republicans know they're not very popular, they know they're more explicit, and they know they're not growing their base. So they're afraid of voters. So the more people who vote, the less likely a Republican candidate's going to win. So they're doing things like to increase or decrease access to the ballot or to the voting booth and things like that. Democrats are afraid of competition. So every year, like 2020 was a great example, they had one of the most diverse pool of primary candidates that we've ever had. More people of color, more women, more LGBTQ. But then they do what they always do, which is they nominate the most mediocre, status quo, white landowning male from the 1% they could find. And so what they're concerned about during the general election is that their base, which is more diverse, is going to wander because their candidate doesn't reflect their base. So it's the Democrats that are suing to keep people off the ballot. It's the Democrats that are fighting to keep other candidates' voices suppressed. Do you know what Joe Biden's strategy is against Cornel West? Do you know? To ignore him. To ignore him, literally. That's his strategy, to ignore him. This candidate who loves the black people so much, he's going to ignore a black candidate. Not even acknowledge that he's running. So this is the challenge, right? Our two-party system. So I'm convinced, but I'm also convinced, like, and I'm glad Cornel West is now running as a Democrat, or as an independent. I honestly think he should run as a Democrat. To win in the independent category, you have to be able to take votes from the left and the right. And Cornel West is a left-leaning liberal candidate. He would do much better, have more success if he challenged Joe Biden in the primaries than just trying to steal left-leaning voters during the general election. So I think this is where we need to have voices from an independent place who can actually be the unifying. Most Americans are registered independent. They're not even registered with the two parties. The independent party is the largest voter registration in the country. Doesn't mean there's that many independent voters, but they're just people who don't want to commit right away. They still lean left or right. And so we need strong, independent candidates who are truly able to speak to both the left and the right. Someone like Cornel West is primarily speaking to a left audience, so he's going to do much better running as a Democrat than as an independent. So in my opinion, that's the thing we need to do, but that's also why I work very hard in all of my talks to critique both sides, and it actually gives me the permission to speak as boldly as I do, to make the critiques that I make, and to get people to say, wow, that's compelling stuff. Republicans will listen to me once they understand I'm not trying to convert them to becoming a Democrat. They'll listen to me, right? Democrats listen to me until they realize I actually want to change something. And it's like, well, we like the system, we just like to protest it. And so this is where I think we need strong voices in the middle who are able to actually create the dialogue from both sides of our very binary nation. our very polarized nation? I like that question. Thank you for asking that. Yes?
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Pastor Charles. Are you running again? That's the first question.
Yes. I am not running in 2024. The reason I'm not running is I'm not famous enough. The strategy used against me by both the media and the parties in 2020 was to ignore me. Anyone who found my campaign loved it. But most people never heard of me, and it was easier to ignore me. And so I'm actually using Cornel West as my gauge, right? The Biden administration right now and the Trump administration are working to ignore him. And if I want to see if he ever gets the attention of both the media and the two parties. And that will give me a gauge about how famous do I need to be to run again as an independent.
So,
but
Pastor
I love
Charles,
the question.
Being a reverend minister, what do you think would bring more under your fold, so to say, that you haven't done yet? You know, you're not a politician. So are you going to study politicians? But if you do that, you're at the peril of becoming one of them. How do you get around that? And how do you appeal to those who would see your point of view?
Yeah. So my primary goal, my goal before I die, is I want to create this national dialogue on race, gender, and class. I want that conversation. My second goal is I want to edit our Constitution. I don't want to amend it, because that's a footnote at the end. I want to edit it. If you go on my website, wirelesshogan.com, you will find a draft of the Constitution I had where I went through it with a strike-through font. Took out all the racism, all the sexism, all the white supremacy. Didn't change balance of powers, didn't change checks and balances. I just made our Constitution say what most people think it says already. Every gender-specific male pronoun I replaced with a proper noun or a gender-neutral pronoun. Amen. Right? Had I won the race, my strategy was to, for my inaugural address, I was going to read our Constitution. I have Supreme Court justices, I have governors, I have a global audience. When I got to the first gender-specific male pronoun, the president, he, I would turn to my audience and say, certainly we can all agree a woman could fill this role. When I got to the clause keeping slavery legal in prison, certainly we can all agree that we should abolish slavery completely, leaving it legal nowhere. When I got to the part saying excluding natives, certainly we can all agree, right? So I'm doing two things. A, they can't disagree with me. B, I'm educating a global audience on the racism, sexism, and white supremacy rooted in our Constitution, thereby embarrassing white landowning men to the core. At the end of my speech, I would have walked up to the Speaker of the House, laid my draft of the Constitution down, and said, I want this passed next week. Now, I'm not saying they all would have liked me, but I don't think they could have voted against it. I don't think they could have. And then, now that we have a foundation that doesn't elevate one over the other or diminish one compared to the other, now we can start the real work of removing the systemic racism and sexism and white supremacy from our laws, now that it's actually not constitutional anymore.
Pastor Charles? Great. But I have a baseline question. How do you appeal to the masses, so to say? This is preaching to the choir in here who are buying what you're saying. But how do you, across the board, get to everyone?
Again,
big
yes.
and small,
yes.
High and low.
That's a much more in-depth question, but the way I do it, I speak just as boldly to my right-leaning audiences, and I get more enthusiastic responses. The trick is how do I get them into the room? I gave a book tour a year ago. My biggest audience was in Orange City, Iowa. A stone's throw from where Donald Trump said he could stand out in New York and shoot somebody and not lose a single supporter. And I had my biggest audience there. The problem is getting them into the room. And that's actually another reason I'm not running in 2024, is because I have not yet figured out how to get them into the room. But I'm working on it. Thank you for the question.
So Derek's going to ask, and then I have a couple from our online community.
Okay.
I'll be real quick because my first question was going to be what Dr. Okome asked, why aren't you running? But would you consider, what's come up for me over the last few years in being involved in social justice is building power. And would you consider working with some of the Democrats who are going against the grain collectively to kind of amplify your message, who will probably align with you, actually? The other question is, would you consider someone like Cornel West, instead of gauging, maybe working with him? Would you run with him, for example? And then the third thing is, what you just described about the Constitution sounds a lot like an amendment or a bill that maybe might be able to be put forth. And I think there would be value in seeing that reading of the Constitution, if you consider it as almost like a performance, to kind of put that possibility out into the world and give it a chance to resonate and sit with people and kind of, create a movement that way. So just those thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, I do. I end up partnering with a lot of Democrats because, again, they like my ideas when they're ideas. Once it becomes I have concrete steps to change, that's where I lose most of my Democrats. The Democratic Party has done a very good job of scaring its members into not supporting anyone else but Democrats. And so that's what I learned in the 2020 election, is I have to actually find a way to counter the narrative and the fear that's mongered by the Democratic Party. And I have to actually challenge those very people you were just talking about, that this sort of change is going to mean bucking your own party and being labeled even a traitor for supporting someone who's only going to give votes to the Republican. That's the whole narrative they have, even though that's not a true narrative. It's not Biden's vote. It's right. And not as much, but I talk about wherever I go, and so this is where I bring this into my dialogue.
Hi, friends. I have some questions from our siblings online.
Okay.
Were you finished with that answer?
How are we doing on time here?
I don't know. I just asked because it seemed like a conversation was
I
starting.
think we can go real quick. I
Okay.
can touch base with him afterwards if we need to.
I would also say between 18 and 24-year-olds, there's a 70% drop-off in support for Biden, so they might be your way in. A comment from those online: I'm so happy you put Lincoln in an accurate light. My mom always taught me he cared nothing about Black or Native lives. And then here are there two questions. I'm wondering about the connecting issues between the indigenous people of Mexico, Central and South America, and the indigenous people of the United States. A large percentage of immigrants have indigenous ancestry. And then the last question is, you said you want us to join you. How can we do that?
So the question about indigenous peoples in the North, Central, and Southern United Americas is the Spanish colonized much differently than Western Europeans did. Western Europeans colonized by exterminating and destroying. The Spanish colonized by intermarrying and kind of weeding, just like breeding people out of existence. Both working towards the same goal. It was both to acquire land and to acquire wealth, but there was two different tactics. And so the issues of indigenous peoples more, and I'm not an expert on this, but what I've observed more in the South, Mexico and further on down, is that, yeah, people have lost their identity. They don't know their identity. They're like, I have some, and you'll meet a lot of people like that in the U.S., but we still have a very strong Native American community of people who know who they are and know where they come from, and that's less common, not completely non-existent, but it's less common in South America. And so it's the way that the two places were colonized. The South was primarily colonized by Spain. You know, we were fighting the Spanish as Navajo people long before we fought the Americans, because they were coming up from Mexico looking for gold. And so we were fighting them long before we were fighting the Americans. So that's one of the ways to understand that. The second question, repeat the second question real quick.
You said you wanted us to join you. How can we do that?
Yeah, so the great thing is all the stuff I just told you, you can't unsee it. Right? You can't unsee it. So you walked into the room and you allowed me. Notice I didn't ask for a donation. I didn't ask you to sign a pledge. I didn't ask you to sign a letter protesting something. I'm trying to change your paradigm. I'm trying to get you to see our history from a different perspective. And I actually want something a lot more valuable than the $20 or $15 I can get you in a donation right now. I want a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. I want a conversation where people are willing to come and put their land titles on the table. We the people is never going to mean all the people until we do something about land titles. If you own a house, if your church owns a building, if your business owns a building, if you own land, if a Native nation were ever to sue you, if the Lenape came and sued the church for this building, the defense the church would have to hold, ultimately, by the time it got to the Supreme Court, would come down to the doctrine of discovery. Your land title is not based on a treaty. The Supreme Court doesn't say, well, we had a treaty with this nation here and a treaty with that nation there, and so we have the rights to North Carolina through this treaty and the rights to Denver through that treaty and the rights to... No, they don't have that. They had treaties, but they broke them all. So when it comes to legally defending why does Native nations not have access to their lands anymore, it doesn't go down to a treaty, it goes down to the doctrine of discovery, which again states that natives aren't human, we're savages. This doesn't mean I, as a native man, can't go out and buy a piece of land. I can. But my tribe doesn't own our reservation. That's trust land held for us by the U.S. government. I tell people that Native nations, we own land. We're sovereign over our lands like your teenage child is sovereign over your bedroom. Right? They can put a sign on the door, but it's your house. It's the same way with most Native nations. And so, in my work to build a nation where we the people actually means all the people, we will not get there until we change how we deal with land titles. And as appalled as many of you are today at what I said in the last hour and a half, I'm confident none of you are yet willing to have a conversation with your land title in play. This is where I don't want to have this change happen tomorrow. I want it within my lifetime. But first, I have to disgust you enough with what you're standing on to say, I can't live this way anymore. When I talk to churches, right, my co-author, Soong-Chan Rah, brilliant man, one of my best friends, the book he published before we published this book together was called Prophetic Lament. In Prophetic Lament, he points out how anemic the church is at lament. it has to go back to triumphalism, right? I tell people it's almost impossible to lament when you believe in the myth of your own exceptionalism. There's no space to lament. And he points out lament is not repentance. It's not asking for forgiveness. It's like going to a funeral dirge, right? Where you go there to mourn. You go there to grieve. Americans can't even sit through a Good Friday service without leaving and saying, well, Sunday's almost here, right? We can't even leave a Good Friday service and lament. And so my call, and even the call of our book, is we are calling the church to respond to this, not by repudiating the doctrine of discovery yet, but by lamenting it. Lamenting this brokenness, sitting in the brokenness, to convince yourself how broken this system is and how badly you want change. The problem is because you're not convinced it's that broken, you're not willing to put much effort into making it change. And so I am literally trying to overwhelm people, not to the point of despair, but to the point of acknowledging this thing is broken. So the next time myself or someone like me brings a radical idea for change to the table, you will be primed to say, I'm going to go for that. I want to work towards that change. Right? This is one of the reasons I do my book study special. I could almost script for you the questions I get asked immediately after a lecture. I could script it to you. Almost all of those are rooted in the shock and the denial that you've been living in for so long. I usually stay 2 days, and the second day I have better conversations. People, after they get some REM cycles in and sort some things in their brain, have a bit more deeper question. But the best conversations I ever have are when I ran into people randomly 3 to 6 months later. They're like, Mr. Charles, I read your book, I heard you speak, I saw your video. I can't stop thinking about it. I want to talk to you about this thing or that thing. Those people are primed for change. That's why I do the book study special, because I always get to have the day of conversations and the day after conversations. I rarely get to have the 6 to 9 month conversations. And so when I do the book study special, people read the book, they discuss it with their book, and then they set up a Q&A with me, and I get to sit and talk with them about what they've been thinking about. People say, well, isn't that a lot of work to do those studies? I'm like, it's not work. This is why I wrote the book, right? I'm trying to find a way to have these conversations. And so, yeah, I offer those virtual Q&As for free because I live for those conversations. And so if people are willing to buy my book, I want to find a way to have discussion with them about it. So, yes?
Thank you very much. Just to introduce myself, I'm not a member of this congregation. I am here visiting. I'm a Palestinian Christian Australian and a former Australian diplomat. So I sit here and I wonder from a political and diplomatic perspective, having just heard your talk, for which thank you. I guess 2 questions. Firstly, if the so-called union is sort of predicated upon this idea that one race is supreme to another, and then that's sort of led to, if you like, the union, which you now might call the United States, is the perfect antidote to that, I guess, localism, is the antidote to that new and imagined constructs around how people engage with power. And I guess the second question is, how do you see Indigenous communities being able to partake in conversations around environmentalism and given the wide scope of climate change, do you think that it's time for a new construct altogether?
Great questions. The first question is, what's the antidote to what we've been talking about if we're rooted in these white supremacist ideas from our foundations? And the second is Native voices in conversations about environment and things like that. I will try to answer those quickly. This is, I think, our last question, so people can get home this afternoon. But so I mean, I've been working towards this national dialogue on race, gender, and class. I really think that's the solution. I'm trying to learn from what went well and what didn't go well in the other places it happened, in Rwanda, South Africa, and in Canada. What went well in each of those, what didn't go so well, and how can we change those? Again, I'm not trying to change the way we govern ourselves, as I'm actually trying to get us to make the changes so we can be who we say we are, which is a bit easier battle, I think. So maybe there's some practicality of why I'm doing it that way. The other question regarding Native voices in an environment, absolutely, I agree. We need to have Native voices in this conversation. And let me just tell you a story to kind of frame that. I'm going to frame it around immigration, but it's the same issue. When I began this journey 20 years ago, I was the pastor of a small church in Denver, Colorado, called the Christian Indian Center. And we were wrestling with what does it mean to be Native and be Christian. We got connected with indigenous Christians all over the world, and that journey convicted myself and my wife that we should move back to my reservation. I had grown up in a border town. I had never lived on our reservation. I didn't know my language. I didn't know our customs and our culture. So we moved back, and we wanted to be in the most remote place we can find. And so a member of our congregation in Denver had a hogan, a traditional sheep camp, middle of nowhere. It was 6 miles off the nearest paved road. It was a one-room hogan, traditional hogan, log walls, dirt floor, no running water, no electricity in that entire community. Our neighbors were rug weavers and shepherds. We had an outhouse about 50 yards outside of the house. We moved back there completely ready to live off the grid. But when we got there, the most difficult thing about living there was how absolutely isolated we felt. Literally felt we dropped off the face of the earth, right? I could list on one hand the number of non-native peoples who came to visit us in our hogan the first 2 years we were living there. We lost almost all contact with non-native peoples living in that hogan. As we were living there, I was learning more about the history. I was observing the historical trauma of my people. I was seeing the brokenness of what had resulted in our people and our lands. And I was learning about the Doctrine of Discovery, and I was becoming more and more angry. And I was looking for a way to process it. And I was trying to talk to my friends. Again, this is the early 2000s, so over the phone, sometimes over email. But not in person, because none of them were coming to visit me on the reservation. And every time it came up in a conversation, I could feel myself getting angrier and angrier. And eventually I'd have to bite my tongue or hang up the phone so I wouldn't yell at my friends. I learned how to talk about it in the third person, like I read it in the newspaper. This allowed me to stay in the conversations longer. But the longer I was in the conversation, the more quickly my friends would get flustered. Like, it wasn't me who did that to your people, it wasn't my family who did those things. And soon they would hang up the phone, not knowing where else to go or what else to say. One day, for like the 10th time, I was trying to articulate to my friends how it felt to be Native American living on the reservation in the middle of this country. And I said to my friends, I was writing a letter to them, I said, it feels like our Native communities are this old grandmother who has a very large and a very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they locked us upstairs in the bedroom violently. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party inside our house. Now, they've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to the bedroom, but it's much later. We're tired, we're old, we're weak, we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts us the most, that causes us the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, "Thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house." I wrote that, and that's it. That's exactly how I'm feeling. I started articulating that to people I live near. One man said to me, he said, Mark, I lived here all my life. I've never known how to explain to people how it feels, and you're hitting the nail on the head. I started sharing that with my non-native relatives, friends. And instead of getting angry, they would come back and say, well, how do I say thank you? How do I express gratitude to the native nations in my city, my state, my country? See, now we're having a very different conversation. Now, instead of talking about victim versus oppressor, we're talking about the root of the problem, which is this reversal of roles. See, we live in a nation that likes to inaccurately refer to itself as a nation of immigrants. Calling the U.S. a nation of immigrants excludes the two most systemically oppressed people in our country, which is African Americans who didn't immigrate here. They were kidnapped and brought here and enslaved, and Native peoples who are indigenous to these lands. We're not a nation of immigrants. I was out herding sheep one day in that Hogan, in that community. The man who was a shepherd, my friend, he was a boarding school survivor. He spoke better Navajo than English, lived there most of his life. This was the early 2000s, and he and I were walking through the fields. And as we were walking, I said to my friend, I said, you know, they're starting to talk in D.C. about immigration reform, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on the matter. He said, well, there's already so many of them here, maybe we shouldn't worry about borders anymore. Now, if we were anywhere else in the country, you would immediately think that he was talking about the 14 million undocumented who come over our southern border. But because we're on a reservation, because we're both Native, because he's a boarding school survivor, you have to pause and ask, is he talking about the 14 million or the 300 million who've been coming over primarily from Europe for the past 500 years? And I love the ambiguity so much I didn't even ask him to elaborate. I just left it there. And I started teaching people that without natives at the table, the United States of America is incapable of comprehensively and justly reforming immigration law. Without natives at the table, all you have is one generation of undocumented immigrants trying to figure out what to do with another generation of undocumented immigrants, and there's no integrity in the dialogue. I shared that with organizations I was partnering with. Most of them left-leaning, most of them very liberal, and they loved it. I was speaking at their conferences, I was writing for their magazines, I was preaching in their churches. They loved it right up until the point that the Gang of Eight put a comprehensive bill, a bipartisan bill for comprehensive and just immigration reform in the Senate. The moment that bill existed, every single one of my left-leaning Democratic institutional partners dropped me like a lead balloon. Because now their lobbying machines had a bill to pass, and no one wanted to talk about the backstory. I would embarrass you if I told you the names of the people who dropped me. I would embarrass you. This is the challenge we face. We have a nation of undocumented immigrants who've never asked for, nor have they ever received permission to be here. And they're living here like they own the place. Meanwhile, we have 6 million indigenous peoples, people from these lands, who have been pushed off to the margins of society and were being treated like unwanted guests in someone else's house. Doesn't matter if we're talking about immigration law, if we're talking about environmental law, all of these things. What I need is for our uninvited guests to understand in some very real and practical ways they are guests in someone else's house. And what I want my Native people to understand is that we are the host people of the land. And we need to step into our role as the host. And if we can do that, conversations like immigration, conversations like environment, conversations like all the things that Western society is banging their head against the wall trying to figure out, we would have some very profound insights. I'm not saying the solutions, but some very profound insights as what does it mean to live here sustainably. We've been doing it for hundreds, even thousands of years. We have a few tips, but we're not in the dialogue. And so, yeah, I think we have to create the space, and that's what this work is about. That's what I'm trying to do, is I'm trying to create that space where we're not just talking about victim versus oppressor, we're talking about the reversal of roles and how destructive that reversal has been. I love that question. Thank you for asking that. That's a great one to end this afternoon on. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Honored to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Pastor Mark Charles. Thank you so much. This invitation to join you in recovering our history. If you want to do that, please buy Mark Charles's book. This is me promoting it, not him. It's a really great book. Buy one for your friend. It's been signed as well. And Mark Charles will be out back there to help process your payment for that. I also want to say that just as important as it is for us to learn and recover our history, to learn the backstory of what has happened, it is also important for us to take action. So our anti-racism task force just wants to borrow a couple of minutes of your time to present a call to action in response to what we've heard today.
Yes, the action has already started. I know a petition has already come around. Let me just say up front, also plan to call your senators and representative about the boarding school commission. Here at Riverside, as Pastor Mira said, we're working to put legs under any learning with action. And the action we're proposing today is to join with partners in the National Native American Boarding School Coalition to advocate for creation of a federal Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding school policies in the United States. And you have information that you will get going out, a flyer and a postcard about it for more details, and a great website to refer to. This is this resolution to create the commission. The commission would be similar to one established by the Canadian government in 2007. A bipartisan bill has been introduced in the US Senate, and a House committee is refining its version. US Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, who is a Native person, has put her energy behind this need for truth and healing. She's visited widely places where schools were. There were more than 500 Indian boarding schools across the US. More than 400 of them received federal funding, and many stayed open well into the 20th century. So please write and phone. The petitions we'll get definitely to the senators for New York. And if there are New Jersey or Connecticut signatures, we'll make sure those senators hear about this. But we've got to be a little louder than a petition. This is just a start. So today, leave messages with your senators. Tomorrow, make a call to their office and tell them that you really want this commission established. We see today's action as only the first at Riverside on the boarding school issue and other issues of justice for Native Americans and for African Americans as well.
Thank you so much, Carol. Also, briefly want to announce that in May or April, it's April, the book club is reading Unsettling Truths. So if you want to get your copy so that you have 4 months, today's the day to get it. And we're hoping to have Mark Charles at that book club study. And I just want to close us out by saying a few words of blessing, and I'll use the words that Mark Charles spoke, and he signed this in the copy of his book. I know I'm really pushing his book right now, but he says this: Go out and walk in beauty. So may you all remember who you are, whom you belong to, beloveds, and remember that as you walk with beauty, in beauty. Amen.